Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Gail Kurtzman. I'm the Director of Programs and Events at Beth Tikvah Synagogue, and on behalf of our Adult Education Committee, I would like to welcome you again today to the second in our three-part series, Straight from the Headlines, with lawyer and researcher Eric Gertner. Today's topic for discussion will be genocide in the Ukraine. And of course, in addition to those of you in person, we welcome our audience online. So thank you for joining us online. I'm sure you're enjoying this day of credit. Again, for those of you who are online, please feel free to direct any questions into the chat to answer them at the end of the program. I think we're going to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the program. And of course, as usual, we'll send out this recording along with Eric's source list. So you can do your own further research. Now I'd like to hand it over to Eric.
Thank you. As Gail mentioned, today is the second series of ripped from the headlines. And as you hopefully have been able to view, Supreme Court decision in Dobbs, which overturned Roe v. Wade. This talk today is, as Gail mentioned, talk about genocide in Ukraine. And as you can imagine, the topic of genocide is a very large topic. So I can't obviously deal with everything, but there are some key points that I want to make. But in order to get to the issues in Ukraine and the attack by Russia on the Ukraine, it's important for me to provide you with a little bit of background to the law of genocide, how it came about, how it was developed, how it's been used, and I need to do to ensure that the law gets enforced more than it has been up to date. So I have a personal connection to this topic, and I have a professional connection to this topic. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. My mother spent a little less than a year and a half in Auschwitz, and then was moved to Gross Rosen. She was lucky to survive those experiences. My dad was a slave laborer for about 3 years, and he fortunately was able to escape from the Nazis in February of 1945, and eventually the family became. Brother being born in Germany after the war, I was born in Israel after the war, and eventually we made it to Canada in 1953. My professional connection is I'm a lawyer, so obviously genocide and the law of genocide is a legal topic, but I was fortunate to win the prize in public international law when I was in law school, so I have a long connection to international law and public international law in particular. And obviously, because of my own parents' experience, the topic of genocide is a particularly significant one for me. So, as you probably know, this century has seen a significant number of genocides. It starts with the Armenian genocide in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, the largest genocide with the most What's really interesting is we've probably seen another 10 genocides since the end of World War II, most of them in the 20th century, but we've already had 2 or 3 in this century. And what's interesting is the ones in the 20th century and in this century all occurred after 1948, 1951, and 1952. Now, you might wonder why I picked those dates. And that the reason for that is that the genocide is an internationally agreed to agreement, which now has more than 150 signatories, so it's obviously been widely adopted, was first adopted in 1948 by the United Nations, which was a new organization at the time. In 1951, the convention was ratified, which means that it had sufficient signatures on the part of parties to have the convention implemented by those countries who had to do something to implement it, like domesticating it by passing their own laws to adopt what's in the convention. So that's 1948 and 1951. Canada adopts the convention in 1949 and ratifies it in 1952. The United States adopts it in 1948, so almost immediately after it was enacted by the United Nations. It doesn't actually ratify the agreement until 1988. It has now, as I said, come into force. There were enough signatures in the early 50s to achieve that end. And as I said, most countries now have adopted it. There are obviously a number of genocides that you would be familiar with, but I'm going to mention some that may be not as apparent to you, or you might not understand if they were actually genocides because they were government in their own country, as opposed to actions by another country against the citizens of yet another country. So Cambodia is obviously one of the most significant genocides. There's probably 1 million victims in the Cambodian genocide. There are genocides in Argentina and Chile, which are really the result of civil wars in those countries, with thousands of people having disappeared by the juntas that took over the countries and the governments of those countries. And perhaps one of the largest genocides that very few people are familiar with, which is another sort of civil war. It occurs in Indonesia in the 1960s, where over 500,000 people are murdered by the government. And the people who are murdered are considered to be socialists and communists. And so, we've seen, as I said, in the last 70 years, a significant number of genocides. As I said, the most significant is the Holocaust. It obviously involved the murder of 6 million Jews, but it also involved the murder of thousands of Roma and Sinti. It also involved the murder of people who were disabled and, in the words of the Nazi government, had a life that was unworthy of life. And so they were killed by the Nazi regime. And of course, there were lots of women who were sterilized during that period of time. In this century, we've seen at least, as I said, 3, maybe 4. We have the situation that's happening in Myanmar with the Rohingya, who were basically thrown out of the country and attacked. We have the situation in Iraq with the Yazidis, who were attacked by ISIS. And in China, we have the situation with the Uyghurs, where approximately 1 million people have been sent to penal colonies in the western part of China. Now, it's important to remember that the convention dealing with genocide is a convention, as here's the title, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So while there has been a number of cases where people involved in genocides have been prosecuted, there hasn't been a lot of prevention. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. So let me begin by talking about how the convention comes about. And again, you might be familiar with this name. Many people are not. The idea for this genocide convention and a law dealing with genocide comes from a Polish Jew by the name of Raphael Lemkin. And he's a law student, becomes a lawyer, and he takes an interest in the Armenian genocide and wonders why nothing has happened to punish the people involved with that genocide. And of course, quickly he realizes the reason for that is there's no law that prohibits genocide. And so he makes it his life's work to try to convince world leaders that there should be a convention adopted to deal with genocide. And his experience, he obviously has his own personal experience. A Polish Jew, he is able to escape Poland in 1940. He makes it to Lithuania. He then makes it to Sweden, and ultimately he makes it to the United States. And obviously he is a fairly bright and convincing fellow, because he ultimately becomes an advisor to Robert Jackson, who's the head of the US prosecution team in Nuremberg in 1945, 46, 47. And all the while, he is pushing this idea of adopting a law to deal with genocide in particular. He writes a very influential book in 1944 called The Access Rule in Occupied Europe, which obviously is dealing with the scheme and murders committed by the Nazis. He also has his own personal tragedy. His family, many members of his family are killed in the Shoah. He is able, as I said, to escape via Lithuania, Sweden, and ultimately makes it to the United States. His only surviving relatives are his brother and his sister-in-law and their 2 children, who ultimately survived the war and settled in Canada in 1948. So we have we have a Canadian connection to the Lemkin story. He basically goes around trying to convince people to enact a law that deals with genocide. And as I've already mentioned, he ultimately convinces members of this new world body, the United Nations, to adopt a convention that deals with the prevention and punishment of those involved in genocide. He, as I said, spends some time advising the American team at Nuremberg. Obviously, what happens at Nuremberg is the conviction of a number of Nazis in various categories. The one thing Nuremberg does not do, which should be obvious, is it doesn't convict anybody for the crime of genocide, because in 1946 to 1947 and 1948, when the major trials were conducted, there was no law on genocide. He returns to the United States. He ultimately moves to Brooklyn, and he dies in poverty. And he thinks his mission in life has been unsuccessful. And he commits suicide, and they find a note in his room in Brooklyn, which says, "The fact that the rain of my world will fall on a fallow plain, only this rain was a mixture of the blood and tears of 8 million innocent people throughout the world. Included also were the tears of my parents and my friends." So Lemkin has a tremendous impact on the world. As I said, the convention gets adopted in the early 50s, and we see that there are genocides that are occurring in our lifetime, in the 1990s in particular, where there is no body to deal with the victims and the criminal acts of genocide. And ultimately, until there is a body that can deal with these cases, there are ad hoc tribunals that are set up to deal with the genocide in the countries that formerly made up Yugoslavia, and then another tribunal that deals with the genocide in Rwanda. Rwanda, there are approximately 800,000 to 900,000 victims in about a period of 3 or 4 months in Rwanda. The war in the former Yugoslavia lasts a little bit longer, and there are only 200,000 victims. So Lemkin is a very important figure in the development of the law on genocide. He basically creates it himself. He pushes this idea forward, and eventually it's adopted. So let me talk a little bit about the convention before going on. So there are some important features of the convention, and the convention is, as UN conventions goes, pretty short. It has about 20 or so articles, and all the articles are pretty short. So Article 2 is, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And if you can remember some of those, you'll see that there are echoes of that in what Russia is doing in the Ukraine. And Article 3 says the following acts shall be punishable. So obviously genocide is punishable. Conspiracy to commit genocide is punishable. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide, the same. Attempt to commit genocide, the same. Complicity in the genocide, also punishable. And again, this is not unusual in criminal law. All these acts in respect of things like murder would be equally punishable. Article 4 says persons committing genocide or at any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3, which I just read, shall be punished, whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. Well, why is that provision there? The provision is there because up until this point in time, there is generally a recognized doctrine of what's called sovereign immunity or state immunity. So it means that the sovereign of a country or the state officials of the country are immune from prosecution, not just in their country usually, but in any other country. And every country recognizes the sovereign immunity and state immunity of the officials in other countries. So it's important to have that provision to overcome that idea of immunity. And again, the convention goes on to say the contracting parties undertake to enact in accordance with their respective constitutions the necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the present convention, and in particular to provide effective penalties for persons guilty of genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3. Article 7 deals with extradition, and basically it says there is no excuse to refuse extradition because the acts are alleged to be political. So it's another way of ensuring that the people responsible for genocide can be punished, even if they're not punished in the country where they live. They can be punished in other countries if they are captured and can be tried in those countries. So that's the Genocide Convention. Very short, as I said, up until basically the late 1990s and into this century, there are no prosecutions under the convention itself because there's no body to deal with them specifically. 1998, we have the International Criminal Court created under the Rome Treaty, and now there's a body that specifically can deal with these international crimes. Again, it's not to say that other countries couldn't prosecute people before then, but they had to adopt the law and domesticate the law, which means make it part of their own law in order to be able to punish or prosecute people for the crime of genocide. So here's a very brief description of the conventions that predate the Genocide Convention. The law was not bereft of ways to deal with certain kinds of acts before the Genocide Convention. We had the Hague Conventions that dealt with the way that war is to be conducted and how it's not to be conducted. And there's two conventions, one in the late 1800s and one in the early 1900s. There are subsequent Geneva Conventions to deal with the position of civilians in wartime. And here's a very brief description of the Geneva Conventions as found on the Wikipedia. It says the Geneva Conventions are 4 treaties and 3 additional protocols that establish international legal standards for humanitarian treatment in war. The singular term Genocide Convention usually denotes the agreements of 1949, negotiated in the aftermath of the Second World War, which updated the terms of the two 1929 treaties and added 2 new conventions. The Geneva Conventions extensively define the basic rights of wartime prisoners, civilians, and military personnel, established protections for the wounded and the sick, and provided protections for civilians and around a war zone. Moreover, the Geneva Conventions also defines the rights and protections afforded to non-combatants, such as civilians. The treaties of 1949 were ratified in their entirety with reservations by 196 countries, which basically means although countries adopted these conventions, they've sort of said, except we sort of don't agree with that part, or we don't agree with some other part. The Geneva Conventions concern only prisoners and non-combatants in war. They do not address the use of weapons of war, which are instead addressed by the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907, which concern conventional weapons, and the Geneva Protocols, which concern biological and chemical warfare. So we now have a lot of international law dealing with the way war is conducted and who is to be protected and in what circumstances there's to receive that kind of protection. So before I turn my attention to what's going on in Russia, it's, I guess, important to talk about what Canada has done. As I said, Canada ratified the the Genocide Convention in 1952. In the 60s or 70s, they enacted legislation to bring parts of the law as part of the Criminal Code of Canada. That was subsequently changed by repealing those provisions and enacting another specific statute that deals with genocide, and it's called the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And again, it deals with some of the same subjects that are dealt with in the Genocide Convention. And in particular, having regard to what happened at Nuremberg, we have section 14, which basically says following superior orders is not a defense to any of these crimes, which we know from Nuremberg. Now, Canada has in fact dealt with a number of individuals who were alleged to have been involved in acts of genocide. Up until we actually took this responsibility seriously. You might recall cases like the case of a number of Nazis, one by the name of Finta, another one by the name of Oberlander. These were Germans who falsified their immigration papers, which was the way that they were able to come into Canada. Canada has a power, like most countries, to when they discover that a person has falsified their papers and when they seek to immigrate to the country, can deport them to their country of origin. The Finta case dragged on for years. The other case dragged on for even more years. And ultimately, while the gentleman was supposed to be deported to Germany or another country, he ultimately died in Canada. So we were not very good at enforcing the law on genocide. Those failures, and even before the last case, the government of Canada set up a commission called the Duchesne Commission to look into how Canada had dealt with Nazis who'd made it into the country on false pretenses. And the Duchesne Commission, which was led by a judge from Quebec, was very critical of how the Canadian government was dealing with these situations. But in the last couple of decades, we have taken our responsibilities much more seriously. There have been 3 cases that really deal with the crimes of genocide. 2 cases are immigration cases, to show you that that issue about falsifying your papers to get into the country is still going on. And then there's actual prosecution in the province of Quebec, dealing with all 3 kinds of war crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, which I'll mention in a minute. The 2 immigration cases are important because they are the first really significant discussion of the elements of these crimes under the Genocide Convention. One of them deals with complicity, which is, as you might recall, is one of the offenses specified in the Genocide Convention. It involves a representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which there's been a war in the Democratic Republic of Congo for probably 30 years. He's a government representative. He ultimately ends up working at the UN, promoting the position of the Democratic Republic of Congo at that body. He eventually decides he's had enough with the government of that state. He comes to Canada and seeks asylum in Canada. And he's initially granted asylum. And of course, that ultimately has to be tested in the courts. And it's argued that he, as a result of his position, representing the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, is complicit in the genocidal acts and the war crimes committed by that country. And that's the issue that it ultimately ends up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says the mere fact that he is a member of the government doesn't make him complicit for purposes of these laws. There has to be more than simply being a representative of the government. He must be pushing the idea behind these crimes, which it turns out he was not. And ultimately his position in Canada, his right to asylum in Canada, is upheld. The one case which in fact results in a prosecution of somebody involved in genocide is a 2014 case of the Quebec Court of Appeal called Munyanestra. And the court, he's charged with numerous offenses. He's in fact charged with 7 charges, 2 charges of genocide, 2 charges of crimes against humanity, and 3 charges of war crimes. And eventually he is in fact convicted at trial, and his conviction is upheld by the Quebec Court of Appeal. And the court decision is important because it's the first decision under the new crimes against humanity legislation where the court actually has to address a number of the issues that come out of these kinds of prosecutions. So for example, the court says, what does constitute serious harm to physical or mental integrity for purposes of the Genocide Convention? That could be established by physical or mental harm, inhumane or degrading treatment, rape, or sexual violence. So those are all the things that could constitute serious harm to physical or mental integrity. With respect to what constitutes an identifiable group for purposes of the Genocide Convention, they say you have to prove that. What's an identifiable group? And you have to prove that the person had the intent to destroy or in whole or in part this group. And there's some other important findings. So let's move on a little bit. Eventually, I said we get to the Rome Treaty in about 1998. We get the first prosecutions properly before the ICC, as it's known. And what the International Criminal Court says constitute grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, which are obviously broader than the Genocide Convention. They list about 28 different acts or 25 different acts, which I'm not going to read, but they are the things that you would imagine, including taking hostages, summary execution, pillage, rape, sexual slavery, etc., etc. So what about Ukraine? Well, the first thing I want to just address is the extent of the casualties being suffered in Ukraine. And I don't want to focus on the military casualties because military casualties happen in a war. Civilian casualties are not supposed to happen in a war. That's what the Hague Convention is all about. And of course, if you actually intend to murder members of an identifiable group because they are members of that group, that could constitute genocide. So the latest statistics I pulled from July 12th of this year shows that there are a total of 6,520 injured civilians. And there are 3,706 adults whose identities are unknown. And there are approximately 5,000 civilians who are murdered. So those numbers, given what we know about genocides, are not, really substantial. But if you are actually intending to kill the members of an identifiable group because of your hatred of the group, that would still constitute genocide. As I mentioned, you have to prove both the acts, which are the 5 things I listed, but you also have to prove intent. So how do you prove intent? of this kind of offense? Well, we have an example. We have the example of the Nazi regime and their promise to attempt to exterminate the Jewish race. And what evidence do we have of that? Not only do we have the acts, which obviously occurred, but we have all the statements leading up to the war, where Jews are described as vermin, where they're described as polluting the blood of the pure Aryans, where various acts are taken to single out Jews, where the Jews lose their jobs, the Jews lose their jobs as teachers, as government workers, as members of orchestras. All these are obviously aimed at putting the Jews in Germany initially, but ultimately in many other countries in a very vulnerable position. And ultimately, we know the result of all of that hatred and all of those actions taken against the Jews. So do we have any of that in the case of Ukraine and Russia? Well, I think we actually do. Before the war, we have many statements from President Putin about Ukraine and the illegitimacy of this nation, how it's not a real nation, how it's filled with neo-Nazis. And so we do have indications of something that could establish the specific intent to commit genocide. But what's more important, we also have numerous acts, not just the killing of civilians, but look at the targets that Russia has chosen to attack. They're not just military depots. They're not just troops. There are 400 medical institutions that are targeted. There are civilian homes that are targeted. There are government institutions that are targeted. We have all of the evidence that what Russia is trying to do, and their statements, to annihilate Ukrainians, to destroy the Ukrainian country because they don't see it as a real country. Much like the Nazis didn't see the Jews as real Germans. And so that would probably those would constitute the acts that would show the necessary intent. There are two organizations that have been studying the language and the actions of Russia in particular as it relates to Ukraine. One is called the New Lines Institution, and the other one which is based in the US, I believe, and the other one is the Wallenberg Institute in Canada. And here's some of the things that they mention. So the New Lines says what the Ukrainians have done is they've denied the existence of Ukrainian people as a separate people, just like the Nazis tried to eliminate the Jews. They described the Ukrainians as posing an existential threat to Russia. They describe Ukrainians as neo-Nazis, using dehumanizing language, again, much like the Nazis did. They are conditioning the Russian people to accept the atrocities being done in the name of the country and the people of the country. And obviously, I'm sure that they have plans to murder as many Ukrainians as possible, necessary to take over the country. But we also have acts that are much more atrocious than that. We've seen in the last few months the mass killings in places like the village of Bucha and surrounding villages. We've seen deliberate attacks on shelters, like the famous Opera House attack. We've seen their unwillingness to open up humanitarian corridors to allow people to escape. We've seen indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas, et cetera, et cetera. It's estimated now that 900,000 Ukrainians have been taken by the Russians and brought into Russia. So not only are they attacking civilians in Ukraine, they're actually removing Ukrainians, bringing them into Russia, and What they will do with them, I mean, we don't know yet. They've been seizing humanitarian aid. There have been numerous allegations of rape of Ukrainian women. All of these things, in my opinion, point to acts of genocide. And we have, as I said, the language of Putin as well. Add to that the fact that we have to remember that Ukraine was actually a part of the Soviet Union up until the 1990s, 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart. Ukraine became an independent country like many of the other Soviet socialist republics, like Lithuania, like Latvia, like Estonia. But in the case of Ukraine, there's actually an agreement made between the new Ukrainian government and Russia in 1994 called the Bucharest Memorandum. The origins for that agreement are an effort by Russia in particular, together with other countries, but mainly in the interests of Russia, to remove the nuclear weapons that were stored in the Ukraine by Russia when the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, to have them destroyed. Obviously, the purpose is to remove that as a threat to the new Russia. So they enter into this agreement. Ukraine, in fact, and with the help of others, in fact, destroys all these nuclear weapons. So that's part of the deal. The other part of the deal is to respect the sovereignty of the new Ukraine, which we now know, of course, the Russians have not done. So they've breached this international agreement, which is not just an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, but other parties are also involved. And what they have argued is that the Bucharest Agreement says, obviously, Russia can act in its own self-defense. And of course, that's the argument that Russia has continually made with respect to the reason why they invaded Ukraine. It's filled with neo-Nazis. They have bad intentions against Russia. So we're entitled, exercising our rights both under the Bucharest Memorandum and the right of self-defense recognized by the United Nations Charter, to go and attack the country, and obviously, presumably, to do what they're doing, which of course they're not entitled to do, because what they're doing involves war crimes, crimes against humanity, and probably acts of genocide. So what's the likelihood that members of the Russian government, Russian soldiers, will be ultimately prosecuted for either war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ultimately the crime of genocide? Well, we know already that a number of Russian soldiers have in fact been captured and prosecuted for war crimes. The first one was a soldier involved in the mass killings in Bucha, and he faced a trial in Ukraine and was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment, where he admitted his acts. There have been two other subsequent prosecutions of Russian soldiers, and they're not charged with genocide. They're just charged with war crimes, basically killing innocent civilians. What's the likelihood that Putin will be prosecuted? I'd say, unless he is stupid enough to travel to a Western country, which is prepared to enforce the Genocide Convention, I don't think he's going to be prosecuted. So here we have a situation which is very different than what happened at the end of World War II. The Nazis were defeated. The Nazi leaders were captured. The Allied forces had agreed by 1943 that those involved in prosecuting the war and committing heinous crimes would be prosecuted, which is the reason why we had the initial Nuremberg trial, which starts in 1946. So it's just a little bit, I think it actually starts in 1945 and goes into 46, where the leaders of the Nazi regime are tried and most are convicted and most are ultimately sentenced to death. So unless you can capture Putin, I think it's pretty unlikely that he is going to be tried. Whether other Russian officials involved in this war campaign can be captured, again, I think it depends on their willingness to travel outside the country, and the willingness of Western nations to actually prosecute them should they be caught and captured in a Western country. And as I mentioned earlier, we've now assured by the legislation in the convention, which doesn't grant state immunity to people involved in acts of genocide, that if they are captured, they can be tried. They can't claim any kind of sovereign immunity or state immunity. And we've also had amendments to our own State Immunity Act, which recognizes the common law principles of state immunity, where they have said, people involved in terrorism can be punished, even if they are officials of a government or work for a government agency. And it's quite possible that you could characterize what Russia is doing in the Ukraine as terrorism of a sort. It's possible that they could be prosecuted in Canada if they were caught here. In the meantime, Western nations are more or less limited to taking other kinds of action to punish the Russian regime for their invasion of the Ukraine and for their actions in the Ukraine. And what we've seen is an effort by Western governments to seize the assets of Russian oligarchs who are aligned with Putin, with the seizure of Russian assets found in the West, with an aim of actually not just seizing the assets, but ultimately selling the assets and paying the proceeds over to Ukraine to enable Ukraine to rebuild the country. In the 5 or 6 months since the war started, at the end of February, there's a list of super yachts that have been seized by Western countries, including a yacht called the Scheherazade, which is believed to be the yacht owned by Putin or owned for Putin, which is valued at $700 million. Why do they think it's his yacht? Because the officials or the people working on the yacht happen to be members of the Russian Secret Service. So it's not, common that people who own yachts have CIA people guarding the yacht or whatever. But there have been, yachts seized in Spain, Italy, France. The Scheherazade was seized in Italy. And of course, the oligarchs are attempting to evade their vessels being seized by sailing into safer harbors other than the countries who are clearly members of NATO, where all the nice places are to go to visit. So they're avoiding those places and going to third world countries to dock, hoping that they will be protected there. But other assets are also being seized, not just yachts. The Central Bank of Russia holds some assets in Western countries. There are $30 billion worth of central bank assets of Russia in the United States. Those have been frozen by the United States government. So that's another big pile of money that can help rebuild Ukraine. And there are many other places where assets are being seized. There's obviously some issues about the propriety of seizing these vessels. I think that's less of an issue than actually selling the vessels and transferring the assets to the Ukraine to rebuild the country. Canada has actually enacted legislation under the special measures legislation that it has to give it the power to seize these Russian assets, but also to sell the assets and to provide them to the Ukraine. The US Congress is debating such legislation with claims that such legislation might violate the Constitution because it's taking action without due process of law. Under Canadian law, I don't think it's an issue because any rights that Russia, which is not a person, has or would have under the Canadian Constitution could be overridden by a notwithstanding clause or would probably be saved by Section 1 of the Charter, which says that even though something is in violation of the rights of the Charter, it can be saved if it's justified in a democracy and it's reasonable action taken by law, which this would be. So we have all of these issues that are still swirling around, and ultimately we may have to decide them in the future or not. It's also important to recognize that a number of countries have already taken the position that what Russia is doing in Ukraine, or what it has done in Ukraine, constitutes the crime of genocide. We've had statements from the 3 Baltic countries that clearly have an interest in trying to contain Russia because they might be the next target of President Putin. The Irish Prime Minister has come up with a statement like that. Our own Prime Minister has done that. President Biden has said as much. So there's a lot of support for the idea that Russia is guilty of the crimes of genocide. And the only question now is what action will ultimately be taken against Russia, Russian citizens, Russian soldiers, and Russian bureaucrats, and ultimately President Putin. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Eric. Just a reminder that when we take questions from.
I will repeat.
Okay. I guess my question is like, great that I think, you know, you've defined what's going on in Ukraine, but I feel like history is kind of repeating itself. It's almost like we're back to the Second World War, where the West was on the sidelines watching all this happening in Europe.
Yeah.
And for some reason, didn't want to get involved to stop what was going on. And here we are again. The West is on the sidelines, seeing what's going on, and we're not doing anything to stop it.
Well, you're right. It's similar. The big difference in the equation, not to justify what the West has not done, is that Russia has nuclear weapons and we have nuclear weapons. And of course, Putin and his allies were very smart at the beginning to say, you know, we got these nuclear weapons, we can use them. We not only have nuclear weapons, we have supersonic delivery systems to deliver them to you. So don't do anything stupid. Now, we of course can say, you know what? We don't believe you. Because, you know, if you started, we're dead, you're dead, it's all over. And Mr. Putin, he may have a really good shelter, but, you know, when he's running a country with mostly dead people and people who are severely injured, like, what's the point? So I think we do need a lot more backbone in the West to face up to what Putin is doing in the Ukraine. And, you know, it may ultimately come to that. I think what the West has done up to now is try to help Ukraine in the ways that it can, and in ways that will not trigger a serious reaction on the part of Putin. And this is not an easy game to play, but it's not so different. I mean, the difference between before the war in 1939 and now is the Ukrainians, unlike the Jews, have safe havens that they can run to. So we know that there's 6-8 million Ukrainians who have come to Poland and the Baltic states and other parts of Europe, and some to Canada and the United States. Well, we didn't have the benefit of anybody wanting to take us in. And in fact, when there was a conference set up in 1938 in Evian to discuss that, nobody put up their hand other than Judy's going to tell us. The Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was the only country at the Evian conference to say, okay, we're in, we'll take 20,000. So that's a big difference now. And we have, of course, we have all these countries in the West trying to arm Ukraine. Again, doing it maybe more carefully than they should. I mean, I think the big mistake on the part of the West was not supplying jet fighters to Ukraine early on in the war. And now there's still talk that the US might in fact do that. And that will be a whole different story.
And also, from a news perspective, you can see how this whole issue is like slowly disappearing from the headlines.
Well, that's a great fear. The point that Gail was making is this issue is, as I mentioned before, it's now sort of 6 months into the battle almost. Western democracies have their own problems to try to solve. Will they lose interest in defending Ukraine or supplying arms to Ukraine? I mean, God help us if they do, because Ukraine, I believe, is just the first step. Now, Russia is severely hampered by what is happening in Ukraine. We hear all these reports that their weapons caches are diminishing. I'm not sure they have the industrial base to quickly produce more armaments, but only time will tell.
Daniel, are there questions online? Set up a reminder.
Yes. Two questions.
Rona.
Rona.
If Ukraine had already been part of NATO, scenario played out differently.
The question was, if Ukraine was already a member of NATO, would the scenario have come about differently? Well, I think the answer legally and in theory is yes, because under the NATO agreement, it's sort of like the Three Musketeers, one for all and all for one. If Ukraine had been attacked as a member of NATO, all the other members of NATO would have been required to come to their aid if Ukraine asked for it. Just as happened, the only time that Article 5 of the NATO agreement was invoked was the United States in 2001, after the attack on the World Trade Center, when it basically said, okay, we're invoking Article 5 of the NATO Charter. And how many countries came to serve in Afghanistan after that happened? A lot of them. And some of them didn't necessarily send offensive troops, but they sent armaments, they sent trainers, everybody was engaged. That's obviously not required today. That doesn't mean Western countries can't do those things. But so far we haven't seen, other than provide arms and advice, and I'm sure training to forces. I mean, I think the Ukrainians have put up an incredible fight up to now. I mean, there's 40 million people in Ukraine, so half of those are women. Another part of the other half are children. Russia has 160 million citizens. And, you can see from their parades of their armaments, they have a lot of weapons, not quite as many, a lot more than Ukraine has. Yes.
Going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we have a president who stood his ground. The president has indicated the weakness of the president of the administration of the United States.
Okay, so the question was, does the present US stance with their unwillingness to stand up to Russia show weakness as compared to what President Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he basically said, we're going to blockade Cuba and we're not going to let anything else get by. And, it was hours before people thought we would be in a nuclear war. These were days when I was at public school, taught to hide under my desk in the event of a nuclear bomb, which obviously wouldn't have saved me, but it was something. Yes, sure there's weakness. And I think, there's a lot more nuclear weapons now. I mean, there are nuclear weapons to kill the world population multiple times over. Can a nuclear war happen? I mean, of course it can happen. I don't think, as I said before, I don't think Russia is yet prepared to say, okay, we're prepared to give it up, all up, if NATO enters into the war on behalf of Ukraine, because it's annihilation for them and maybe for us, leaving maybe China to rule the world. I mean, who knows? Yes.
What's the basis for China, for Russia, right? That Ukraine isn't the country?
What's the basis for Russia's claim that Ukraine isn't a separate country? Well, you depend on historians. The Russian historians say Ukraine was always a part of the territory of Russia, going back to thousands of years. There are Ukrainian historians, and I think there are Western historians who say, well, that's not quite true, because Ukraine was a separate ethnic group going back to 800. And the reason why Ukraine wasn't ever a separate country is because Russia and the Soviet Union said, hey, hell no, you can't be a separate country, you're part of us. And they were part of the Soviet Union by force. Just like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were part of Russia, except for the period during the two world wars. It didn't take them long to come back and say, okay, no, you're part of us.
Alex.
Yes.
This was very much like Czechoslovakia in the late 30s. And to me, this seems like the thin edge of the wedge. Hopefully you won't. I think the next move will be in other countries that were part of the former Soviet bloc. I think it's very naive to think that stop.
Yeah, so that wasn't a question, or maybe it was a question. It's naive on the part of the West to believe that Russia will stop at Ukraine. I think if you talk to the leaders of the Baltic states, they will agree 100% with you. You have to understand the population differences. So Ukraine, of the former Soviet socialist republics, is one of the largest of the countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Population of 40 million people. The Baltics, there might be a little more than 10 million people in all of the Baltic countries. Estonia has 2 million people. That, yes, and probably the next target, because that's what people are talking about, is not the Baltic states yet, but Moldova, which has, not a very large army and is an easy target to pick off, just like Georgia was some years ago. So, we say that, history does repeat itself. Maybe we're seeing the possibility that history will repeat itself. God forbid.
Nobody has any questions online. Okay.
They're stunned into silence.
Does anyone else before we? Oh, Marcia has a question.
Using the definition of genocide, on top of it, but you said that the Canadian government, the residential schools, the churches, and doctors who forcibly sterilized some of the Indigenous women
Sure.
committed genocide.
Well, I think if you spoke to the Indigenous peoples leaders, they would say definitely yes. We're going back now 150 years. There was no Genocide Convention. I don't think anybody thinks that the Genocide Convention operates retroactively. That doesn't mean you can't call what happened as defined by the Genocide Convention genocide. There was obviously an attempt in the 70s when the UN adopted a convention with regard to Indigenous peoples to talk about cultural genocide against native populations, as happened in Australia and happened in New Zealand and happened in the United States and happened in Canada. Well, that never made it to the convention. It got defeated. I think Prime Minister Trudeau has said what happened is cultural genocide. If you think about what happened to the Indigenous people, where their kids were taken away from them, their kids were, in a sense, being brainwashed to think of themselves as something other than Indian, where they lost their language, and where ultimately many of them were abused sexually and physically, and many were killed. That certainly sounds like a cultural genocide. And if you looked at the language behind the residential schools, the establishment of the residential schools, to get the Indian out of the Indian, that certainly sounds like cultural genocide to me.
If I stand here.
Yep.
Well, okay. Thank you, Eric, for another engaging discussion. Give us a preview of our next session, which I have to remind everybody is not next Tuesday, but Tuesday, August the 9th. Because I think Marcia's question leads.
Yes,
into
so
next.
the last talk I'm going to do on the taken from the headlines series is really trying to figure out what to do with the victims of genocide or mass killings. And the evidence of these killings in many cases are mass graves. And so until we had this development of mass graves, we didn't really need to think about it, but we do now. And there are not only mass graves that we've discovered in Canada as a result of the residential school problem. Mass graves go back years, even before the time, at the time of the Armenian genocide in the 1914, 1917 period, and of course, significantly during the Holocaust. And we think maybe all this is past history. Well, they recently discovered a mass grave of 8,000 victims, Jewish victims from the Holocaust in the last week or so. So this is a real issue. And the question is how you deal with the problem of mass graves, and should we care? And if so, why do we care? So that's the focus of that talk.
Okay, so we look forward to seeing you 2 weeks time, August the 9th at 10 o'clock. Thank you, Daniel, for handling our Zoom. And thank you everyone watching online and in person for coming today.